This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order Kaldheim there right now if you click on my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa and today I'm bringing you my Kaldheim Limited Archetype Guide. For the last week or so, I've been evaluating each Kaldheim card individually for the limited format, and as always, I conclude that limited review with a guide like this one. In this video, I'm going to talk about the synergies within each of the color pairs in Kaldheim. Knowing the synergies in each of these color pairs goes a long way towards helping you know what cards to value if you end up drafting a particular color pair. This video won't contain a discussion of the cards that are just the best ones around unless they happen to have special synergy within a particular color pair. If you're interested in that kind of thing, where you can find out how good I think each of these cards are, that's what the set review is for. Alright, let's get started with the first color pair. First up, we have one of the tribal color pairs, Blue-Red Giants, which also has an emphasis on spells. I do want to say that this set does not have nearly as big of a tribal focus as it sort of seemed like it might at the beginning of preview season. A lot of the cards we saw are in the theme boosters, and so there's actually really only 3 tribal color pairs in this set. There are some other tribal cards around, and we'll talk about those, but really there's only 3 color pairs that have enough support that they're straight up tribal decks. That said, each of the color pairs does have a particular creature type that it has a lot of, because each of them represents a different realm of Kaldheim, but again, only 3 of them really have a tribal focus. And one of those is Blue-Red Spelt Giants. So most color pairs in this set have more than one signpost uncommon. In fact, for Giants here, there's actually 3 of them. You have Agar the Freezing Flame, who likes it when your Giants or spells or wizards do excess damage to a creature or planeswalker, in which case you get to draw a card. That effect can be really powerful, and obviously it's a giant payoff. There's also Invasion of the Giants, which has a Chapter 2 and 3 that both do tribal giant things. Chapter 2 lets you do 2 damage to something if you reveal a giant in your hand, and Chapter 3 makes a giant cost less mana. There's also Surtland Frostpire, which is less obviously a giant payoff in most ways. You know, it doesn't say anywhere on it the word giant, but it does ask for both blue and red mana, and the effect it has plays pretty well in this giant deck, and that is doing 2 damage to each creature. Most of the giants are bigger than that, and they just won't die to that effect, so it ends up being pretty one-sided, and it's pretty nice to have a value land that can do that in the late game. Every color pair has one of these utility lands, but not all of them are signposts, and so we're not going to see them for every color pair, but we'll see them for some of them. And what I mean by not all of them are signposts is they don't all fit into the particular archetype of a color pair, but they are all good cards. And then there's also a rare that is gianty, and that is Battle of Frost and Fire, which does 4 damage to each non-giant creature and each planeswalker with Chapter 1. So that's the tribal part. Chapter 3 and 2 don't have tribal effects, but, you know, casting a big creature or spell is something this deck will be doing. So those are sort of the signpost cards that are really pushing you and telling you, look, this is what you want to be doing, and that's playing giants. Let's look at the giant payoffs now. So first we'll look at the common and uncommon payoffs. These are more important simply because you'll see them more. We've already seen Agar and Invasion of the Giants. Then we also have Glimpse the Cosmos, a spell that lets you cast it again from your graveyard for 1 blue mana if you have a giant. There's also Frostpire Arcanist, which costs less mana if you have a giant or a wizard. There's also Crush the Weak. It's another card that doesn't say giant on it, but once again, it's an effect that won't kill very many giants in this set. And so it'll play pretty well in this deck, especially because it's also a spell, something this color pair cares about. Frostpire Arcanist, for example, also cares about spells, letting you search up a copy of a spell you have in your graveyard. Squash costs a lot less mana if you have a giant in play. It's also something that will pair pretty well with Agar because 6 damage is usually going to have some, excess happening. And Surtland Frostpire again. Then you also have Lityara Kinseekers, so this isn't a giant, and it doesn't say giant anywhere on it, but it's going to be pretty good in this color pair because it's one of the tribal ones, and you'll frequently have creatures that share creature types enough that Lityara Kinseekers will get going. Basalt Ravager also doesn't say giant anywhere in the text box. It is a giant and a wizard itself, but it has an effect that does damage to any target equal to the greatest number of creatures you control that have a creature type in common, and this is a tribal color pair, and it's a giant, so it is best suited really to this deck. And that's a powerful effect too. So while giants are definitely the primary focus of this color pair, we've also seen within some of these giant payoffs various spell things going on, and there are some more spell payoffs to talk about. In addition to Frostpire Arcanist and Agar, both of which are both spell payoffs and giant and wizard payoffs, for that matter, there's also a couple of other spell payoffs at common and uncommon, and one of them is Dual Strike, which lets you copy a cheap spell. And the other one is Karfell Harbinger, which can tap for mana for instants or sorceries or foretell cards. So those are all the common and uncommon payoffs for this color pair. I'm not going to go through every single giant. Trust me, there's a lot of them in blue-red, so you'll be able to get them and take advantage of these cards. Let's look now at the rares that are payoffs for this color pair. So we've got Cyclone Summoner, which bounce everything that isn't a giant or a wizard, which is pretty great. You've got Calamity Bearer, which doubles the damage a giant source does. You've got Quakebringer at Mythic Rare, who is only really a giant payoff when it's in the graveyard, and when it is, it keeps doing its 2 damage to your opponent every turn if you have a giant in play. Battle of Frost and Fire, we've already seen, it's that rare saga that's a payoff for giants. Reflections of Lityara, again, doesn't say giants anywhere, but if you're in this deck, you probably have enough giants to run Reflections of Lityara, and making copies of all your giants is pretty sweet. There's also Toralf, God of Fury, who isn't a giant payoff in a super obvious way, but like Agar, it likes it when you do excess damage to things, in this case non-combat damage, and because this is the spell deck of the format, you're going to have a lot of spells that do damage, and so Toralf will be at its best in this deck, at least this side of Toralf will be. So that's blue-red. It's the first of the 3 tribal color pairs. Let's move now to another one, which is black-green, where elves are the primary archetype. So here we have Herald, King of Skemfar, an efficient creature with menace who lets you reveal an elf warrior or Tyvar card from the top of your library if it's in the top 5, and you put it into your hand. So it's usually, if you got there in the elf deck, it's a 3 mana 3/2 with menace that draws you a card, which is a great deal. Meanwhile, Skemfar Elder Hall can make elf tokens, and you have a rare saga that's a signpost card, and that's Herald Unites the Elves. It's a very powerful elf payoff. Chapter 1 lets you reanimate an elf. Chapter 2 puts a +1/+1 counter on all your elves. And Chapter 3 makes it so each elf you attack with that turn gives a creature -1/-1 until end of turn. So it's a very powerful elf payoff. Let's look now at the elf payoffs at common and uncommon. In addition to Herald, we also have Return Upon the Tide, a reanimation spell that if you reanimate an elf with it, also makes elf tokens. There's Raise the Draugr, which is not an obvious elf payoff, but it's black, and it pays you off for having lots of creatures with the same creature type, and so it slides in really well here. Roots of Wisdom mills your top 3 cards, and then lets you return an elf, potentially, to your hand. And you'll notice there's a bit of a graveyard sub-theme within Elves, kind of like we saw a spell sub-theme within Giants. I do feel like the graveyard sub-theme here isn't as pronounced as the spell payoff was with the Giant color pair, but it's definitely there. Skemfar Shadow Sage is an elf, and it has an ability that, again, checks for how many creatures you have with the same creature type, and so it'll fit well into this deck, even though you can play it in any deck that has lots of creatures with the same creature type. So what are the rare payoffs? Well, you have, like we saw, Herald Unites the Elves. You also have Skemfar Avenger, which anytime a non-token elf dies will draw you a card and lose you 1 life. Also true of Berserkers, and you'll have a few of those in black that might not be elves, so that's nice. Elvish Warmaster is a very powerful elf payoff. The first time you put an elf onto the battlefield each turn, he'll make a token, and he can also pump all of your elves and give them Death Touch. There's Tyvar Kell, a planeswalker that loves elves. Kind of a signpost card, I guess, because he does have black in his text box. He gives all your elves the ability to tap for black, and then all of his abilities do various things with elves, and he'll be quite powerful. You have Realm Walker, which again is a card that checks for a creature type, and you would name elves with it in this deck and frequently be able to cast things from the top of your library. Haunting Voyage, another card that cares about having lots of things with the same creature type. It can let you reanimate your whole graveyard and get all your elves back, which is pretty sweet. So that's black-green. It is the elf color pair. We saw blue-red as the giant color pair. Now we're going to move into the last of these really pronounced tribal color pairs with changelings. And there's a little more than just tribal stuff going on. Just like we saw in the other two, elves also have a graveyard sub-theme, giants have a spell sub-theme, and changelings have a snow sub-theme. So there's 2 signpost uncommons here that really indicate to you that this is where you want to go. You have Morite of the Frost, a snow creature that's a shapeshifter that has changeling, and that lets you copy your best permanent. If it's a creature, it becomes an even bigger. It's a very powerful card for an uncommon. Then you have the 3 Seasons, which lets you, in Chapter 2, return 2 snow permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. So you're going to need a critical mass of snow to consistently be able to do that, even with mill 3. And then there's a rare that really pushes you towards the Changeling thing, the Shapeshifter thing, and that is the Bears of Lityara, which makes a Shapeshifter token with Changeling. Its second ability lets you turn all your Shapeshifters into 4/4s. And then the third ability doesn't actually say anything about Changelings, but if you've managed to turn a lot of your board into 4/4s because they're Changelings, Chapter 3 will be even better. So let's start with Snow Payoffs here. So we have the 3 Seasons, as we saw. You also have Sculptor of Winter, which lets you untap snow lands, so it's a ramp creature. It's also a snow creature. Blizzard Brawl is a great fight spell, especially if you can get the additional snow bonus going, which makes your creature gain +1/+0 and indestructible before it fights. Icehide Troll asks for snow mana in addition to being a snow creature itself. Spirit of the Aldergard searches up your library for a snow land, and it gets more power for each snow land you have. Avalanche Caller lets you turn your snow lands into creatures. Berg Strider likes it if you pay snow mana to play it, and then it'll lock something down for a turn. Frost Augur, the more snow cards you have, the easier it'll be to draw cards with. Frostpeak Yeti needs snow mana to become unblockable. And Icebind Pillar needs the same thing, snow mana to tap stuff down. Pilfering Hawk needs snow mana to loot. Boreal Outrider likes it when you spend snow mana on your creatures, and if you do, it gets a +1/+1 counter when it comes into play, the creature you cast with that snow mana. So snow is a big thing here, but there's also several Changeling payoffs at common and uncommon. So basically what we're going to see are the blue Giant payoff cards and the green Elf payoff cards that slide into this deck because it has a lot of Changelings that will be Wizards or Elves. So, for example, this deck will be able to lower the cost of Frostpire Arcanist. It'll be able to cast Glimpse the Cosmos from the graveyard. Lityara Kinseekers. If you have Changelings in play, you'll have no problem hitting that trigger to get it to be a better card. Roots of Wisdom will let you return Changelings. Bloodline Pretender lets you name a creature type, and it'll fit into every tribal deck. But if you have like 10 Changelings in your deck, it's just going to hit a lot because you have all of these Changelings that have whatever creature type you name, and it'll just get bigger and bigger in addition to being a Changeling itself. So what rares fit into this deck? Well, we saw the Bears of Lityara. You also have Cyclone Summoner again. This deck's going to have Wizards and Giants in it because you're going to be playing Changelings. Orvar the All-Form has Changeling himself. He doesn't actually do anything payoffy for Changelings. He's more of a payoff for combat tricks and fight spells and stuff, but fight spells obviously go hand in hand with blue-green, so he'll work pretty well here. I have Ascendant Spirit here. It'll work all right in this deck. I do think there's another snow deck, in particular the red-green one, that'll be the best at playing it, which is weird because I said red-green, but that deck can splash really easily, and it has access to the most snow mana, as we'll see, so I think it'll actually be best there. But if you have enough snow mana, it'll be fine in this deck too. Tyvar Kell, Elf payoff, that works for your Changelings. Maskwood Nexus lets you make Shapeshifters, that'll have the creature types you want, and makes it so all your creatures, all the time, have all creature types, which will smooth out some of these payoffs. Realm Walker, we already saw, you can name any creature type if you have enough Changelings. It's going to be pretty easy to draw extra cards with. Elvish War Masters here again. Any Changeling you play will trigger his ability, and you'll get an Elf Warrior token. Reflections of Lityara will be good here because you'll be able to name whatever creature type, and if you have a bunch of creatures with Changeling, they'll trigger it all the time. There's also Yorn, God of Winter, who untaps all your snow permanents, so he's a snow payoff. Same thing for Graven Lore. If you use snow mana to cast it, you get some extra bonuses out of it. The green Snow Sorcery should be here too. It looks like I just left it off, but keep it in mind as well. We'll see it later in this video, but it should also be here because this deck does have snow mana. And so the Changeling deck, being the last of these 3 tribal decks we're going to talk about, works well as a segue into the snow deck. So the Changeling deck is partly a snow deck, and there's also a couple of other snow color pairs, in particular blue-black and red-green. Both of them have some additional sub-themes. Let's start with blue-black, which is about the graveyard and snow. Narfi Betrayer King here is a Snow Lord and a Zombie Lord, but he's the only zombie payoff in the whole set, so don't look at him and think, oh, it's a zombie deck. It's not really. There are a lot of zombies in blue-black. The Draugr are what are represented by this color pair, but he's literally the only zombie payoff around, apart from, some of the Changeling stuff that we've seen. Really, though, what he's pushing you towards is snow, because he pumps all your snow creatures, and he's a snow creature himself, and he needs snow mana to come back from the graveyard. And that's where the graveyard side of things comes in. The blue-black deck has a bunch of graveyard stuff. And so we have Narfi. You also have the Port of Karfell, which mills some of your cards and then reanimates something. So those two cards are really pointing you in the right direction of a snow graveyard deck. King Narfi's Betrayal pushes you in a graveyard direction as well. It is rare, so, it's not really a signpost in the sense that you'll see it pretty regularly, but it does fit in well to this deck because it lets you do stuff with your graveyard and actually your opponent's graveyard. So let's look at the graveyard stuff, and what I mean by that are the cards that are graveyard payoffs and the cards that help you put cards in your graveyard. So we've got Narfi and Port of Karfell already. We've also got Draugr Thought Thief, which can let you mill one card. Frostpire Arcanist, we've seen it already. It likes things to be in your graveyard, and if you have duplicate spells, it'll draw you a card. Glimpse the Cosmos, it's probably not going to be at its very best here because you don't have access to very many giants, but you have access to some and some changelings, and it likes being in the graveyard because you can cast it from there, so I included it here. Strategic Planning helps you load up your graveyard. Draugr Recruiter lets you return a creature card from your graveyard with its Boast ability. Dread Rider turns your graveyard into a potential win condition by slowly damaging your opponent. Koma's Faithful mills some of your library, which this deck will like. Raise the Draugr will help you return creatures of the same type. You can also just return one creature, but generally you want to be returning two. And it will turn out to be zombies in this deck often enough is what you want to name, because blue-black does have a lot of them, but it won't always be what you want to go with. Return Upon the Tide in this deck isn't going to be nearly as good at getting the elf tokens out of the deal, but it'll be able to reanimate big scary things with it, and it's happy to do that. And there's also Way Down, which requires an additional cost of exiling a creature from your graveyard. So those are the graveyard things in this color pair. Now let's look at the snow stuff in this color pair. So we've already seen some of them, like Avalanche Collar, which can turn snow lands into creatures. Berg Strider, which likes it when you pay snow mana for it. Frost Augur, which can draw you extra cards if you have enough snow permanents. Frostpeak Yeti, which can use mana to become unblockable snow mana. Icebind Pillar, which can use snow mana to become Icy Manipulator. Pilfering Hawk helps you loot. So we've seen those, but what we haven't seen are the black snow payoffs. We've got Grim Draugr, which asks for snow mana to gain +1/+0 in Menace. Hailstorm Valkyrie, which asks for snow mana to pump its stats. Priest of the Haunted Edge, which checks the number of snow lands you have in play and becomes a more potent removal spell depending on how many of those you have. And of course, Narfi, who's both a snow and a graveyard payoff. So what rares fit well into this color pair? Well, you have Egon, God of Death, who feeds on your graveyard. So if you have a lot of cards in your graveyard, Egon will stick around. The nice thing about Egon is, even if you can't keep Egon fueled to keep this 3-mana 6/6 with Death Touch in play, it does give itself up and you get to draw a card. That's not a terrible fail case. And in this deck, you can just get it back later and maybe be able to fuel it a little bit better. Throne of Death is the other side of Egon. It also mills you, so it mills some of your library for you, which this deck likes. And it also lets you cash in creature cards from your graveyard to draw a card. There's also Blood on the Snow. This will undoubtedly be the best deck for this card. It's another card that's both a snow payoff and a graveyard payoff. So, it's a board sweeper, but if you use snow mana on it, you get to reanimate something equal to the number of snow mana you spent on it. So it fits really well into this deck between the graveyard and snow synergy that it has going on. Haunting Voyage I have here. I think it'll actually be a little tricky to utilize in this deck, which is kind of sad because it's a graveyard payoff. But you will have a lot of zombies. You'll have some berserkers. You'll have some overlap that'll make it good, but it's probably going to be better in the elf deck, which is a little more supported than a tribal creature type is in this color pair. You've got Draugr Necromancer, who is mostly a snow payoff, really. It lets you turn your opponent's dead creatures. You get to take them, put ice counters on them, and then you can cast them, and you can use snow mana as if it were mana of any color to cast those cards that it exiles. I have Ascendant Spirit here again. It'll work okay here. It'll work at its best in the next archetype we look at, which is red-green. I also have the other side of Yorn, which is Kaldring the Rime Staff, which will let you play snow permanents from your graveyard, which is really good, actually. I think it's a very good card, a good snow payoff. And Yorn himself sort of indicates to you that you can go like Sultai Snow. That is something that'll be doable. Green has a lot of fixing, but just looking at blue-black, you can play Yorn just based on the Kaldheim side and be perfectly happy. There's also Graven Lore, which asks for snow mana. All right, so let's move to the last of the really heavy snow archetypes, which is red-green, which is a red-green snow ramp deck. Our signpost uncommon here is Svella Ice Shaper, which can make snow artifact tokens named Icy Manalith that can tap for mana of any color, so it fixes and ramps for you really well. And then it also has the ability to, if you have a ton of mana, which maybe you do because you're making Icy Manaliths, if you have a ton of mana, you can use its ability and, use it as a mana sink. Like, say you're just drawing lands, you can use that ability and you're probably going to get something out of it in the late game. Arnie Slays the Troll is a little less rampy, but it does things that make sense in a red-green ramp deck. It's going to want to fight creatures because you'll have some of the bigger creatures around. Chapter 2 does ramp you, but it also makes one of your creatures bigger. And Chapter 3 gains you life for the highest power among creatures you control, which also fits well into a deck playing big, scary creatures. Again, the uncommon utility land cycle isn't necessary to show for all of these color pairs because it doesn't have any special synergies within it. The one for red-green destroys a land and makes a troll token, which is nice, but neither of those things really matter very much for this deck in terms of its central synergy. All right, so let's look at the ways you can ramp and fix. Obviously, you have Svella, which can go a long way towards making sure you can splash just with Svella. And one of the reasons Ascendant Spirit and other snow things are going to be good in this deck is because it creates snow artifact tokens that produce mana of any color, but that also means they can be tapped for snow mana. You've also got Open the Omen Paths, which I don't love, but hey, it does ramp you. You have to go down a card to do it, but it does give you some extra mana. You've got Seize the Spoils, which gives you treasure. So that's another reason this deck will be better at sort of playing Ascendant Spirit and splash. It'll be able to splash a bunch of stuff because you have not only Svella, but you have access to treasure tokens, like on a card like Seize the Spoils, which also add mana of any color. Smashing Success, I think, is a pretty terrible card, but, if you destroy an artifact with it, you do get a treasure, so I have it here. Vault Robber might turn out to be a pretty key card in this deck because it lets you turn creature cards in your graveyard into treasure tokens, and it gives you a repeatable source of treasure as a result. And treasure really does a good job of ramping and fixing for you. You've also got Glittering Frost, which turns a land into a snow land and makes that land tap for more mana, which will also be snow land. And this is another reason this deck will be good at making snow mana. It has a card like Glittering Frost in addition to Svella. You've also got Horizon Seeker, which lets you search up basic land cards, which includes snow-covered ones if that's what you need. I don't love Jaspera Sentinel, but if there's a deck for it, it will be this one, because it can produce mana of any color. Sculptor of Winter plus Glittering Frost is pretty gross, and that is something that this deck can accomplish with two commons, so be ready to see that and be frustrated by the massive amount of mana your opponent might have. You've got Replicating Ring, which is a snow artifact that also produces mana of any color. It also eventually turns into a bunch of Replicating Rings, but you're probably not going to get there. Gold Vein Pick is an artifact that makes treasure for you. And Raider's Carve can help you ramp when you attack with it if there's a land on top of your library. So, what are the snow payoffs here? Well, we've seen some of them. Sculptor of Winter. What we haven't seen is Frostbite, which pays you off for having 3 or more snow permanents by becoming a more potent spell. But it's actually the only straight up snow payoff in red. So that is something to keep in mind. To some extent, ramping is maybe a bigger focus for this deck than snow is because of something like that. Because the rest of the snow payoffs at common and uncommon are cards like Burial Rider, which we've seen, Blizzard Brawl, Icehide Troll, Spirit of the Alderguard. So what kind of stuff at common and uncommon is worth ramping into or splashing? Well, one of the cards that'll definitely be at its best in this deck is Path to the World Tree because of its, first of all, it helps you search up a basic land, so it helps you fix, which this deck probably wants. But also, it has a powerful ability that is difficult for most decks to produce the mana for that is a pretty powerful one. It does a bunch of little effects, but it does a bunch of them, and all of them together amount to a pretty powerful card, and this will be the deck that can make Wooburg mana the most easily. We've got Icebind Pillar. This is going to be worth splashing in this deck because it's easy to splash, and the deck has access to snow mana. Poison the Cup, so you can't splash this if you're trying to cast it, but you can off of Foretell, which is really good news, and it's one of the most powerful uncommons in the set, if not the most powerful, and this deck can splash it. A card that's actually red that you can ramp into is Cinderheart Giant, which just gives you a big win condition at the end of the game. It's large. You can get it into play on turn 5 potentially. And even if they kill it, it does something to the board. Ravenous Lindworm will also be nice for this deck. Sometimes you're in trouble when you're in a ramp deck because all you're doing early is trying to search up lands and your opponent's an aggro deck, and by the time you finally get enough mana, you're like 8 life. Lindworm helps with that by just being a large creature, but also, B, you get to gain life off of it, which can really help you stabilize. Rootless U will be good in any green deck, but this deck is more likely to have more creatures it can search up, like Cinderheart Giant or Ravenous Lindworm, than your regular old deck is. Svella Ice Shaper, of course, also is both something that helps you ramp and splash and something to ramp into because that mana sink is a powerful ability. What rares fit well into this color pair? Well, you've got Goldspan Dragon, which loves treasure, and this deck will be able to utilize treasure pretty happily. You've got Tundra Fumarole, a snow sorcery that adds mana to your mana pool if you spend snow mana on it. Blessing of Frost. It draws you a card for each creature you control with power 4 or greater, and if you spend snow mana on that, you get some +1/+1 counters out of the deal, which you kind of need to have for that card to be at its best. Draugr Necromancer, we already saw it in blue-black, but you can splash it here and then cast the things it exiles. Immer's Stern Predator is maybe the biggest bomb in the set. It's up there. It's one of the best around, and this deck can, of course, splash it. You just have to splash black, and this deck will be able to do it. There's also Waking the Trolls, which I think is kind of a bad card, but if there's a deck for it, it's this one. It helps you ramp with Chapter 2, which granted, if you have 6 mana, you're not that desperate for that. Chapter 1 destroys an opposing land, and then Chapter 3 will give you a Troll Warrior token of 4/4 for each land you have that is more than your opponent's land. So if you have 9 lands and they have 8, you get 1 Troll out of the deal. The problem is, even in a deck like this one, it's hard to control whether this actually does something, but if there's a deck for it, it's this one because it will be searching up lands and all kinds of stuff, as we've seen. Faceless Haven will also fit in well here. This deck will have, I think, an easier time turning it into a creature than the others. Same thing with Ascendant Spirit. You have access to all the good snow mana, including your Signpost uncommon, and so being able to make Ascendant Spirit big is a thing. I also have Icebreaker Kraken here as something this deck could ramp into. It does cost double blue, but it feels like the mana in this deck can pull it off. The real question is whether or not Icebreaker Kraken is worth it. It's pretty hard to cast, even in a snow deck. It does have a powerful Enter the Battlefield ability, but if there's a deck for it, this is probably it, not one of the other snow decks because, costs 1,000,000 mana. Essica, God of the Tree, fits in well here. Both sides of her do, but this side's good because it lets you add mana of any color, and that's something this deck likes. And the other side, this is a great payoff. If you can make 5 colors of mana, the Prismatic Bridge is an insane win condition, so that's pretty fun. You also have access to Yorn, who will untap your snow stuff, including your lands. There's also Magda, Brazen Outlaw, who is, a dwarf lord, but also she makes treasure tokens for you. There's also the World Tree, which in the late game can help you produce mana of any color. If there's any deck that can use the activated ability here, it's probably this one, but you need gods for it to actually matter, and so most of the time it won't. So those are the 3 snow color pairs. So we've covered, 3 tribal ones and 3 snow ones, with one of them sort of overlapping. Now we're going to move into 2 color pairs that really care about Foretell. All right, the 2 blue-white Signpost uncommons are Vega the Watcher and Nico Defies Destiny, and both are very obvious Foretell payoffs. Vega lets you, anytime you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, draw a card, and that means, from Foretell. And Nico Defies Destiny gains you life, Chapter 1 for each Foretell card in your exile. Chapter 2 gives you mana to cast cards with Foretell, and Chapter 3 lets you bring a card with Foretell back to your hand. So Foretell is the focus here. It's kind of a grindy blue-white deck that gets extra value out of foretelling with cards like these. So our Foretell payoffs include these 2 cards, but they also include cards that don't actually say Foretell, but they are Foretell payoffs. Cards like Clarion Spirit, which gives you a bonus anytime you cast a second spell in a turn. The reason Foretell works well with these cards that are about casting a second spell is because on the turn you actually cast a spell from Foretell, most of them cost less mana, and thus it will be easier for you to also cast an additional spell. So Clarion Spirit gives you a spirit token every time you do this. Cast a second spell in a turn, which is a very powerful engine. Code Spell Cleric, if it's the second spell you cast in a turn, it puts a counter on something. And it being the second spell in a turn, especially in the early part of the game, won't be that difficult because it only costs 1 white mana. But in the later part of the game, it might need Foretell to really get going. Meanwhile, Doomscar Oracle gains you 2 life every time you cast a second spell in a turn. It also has Foretell for 1 white mana, so it can sort of set itself up after you Foretell it the next turn, play it for 1 white mana, and then play like, a 3-drop, and you'll get to gain that life. There's also Karfell Harbinger, which helps you by giving you some more mana to foretell your cards or cast instants or sorceries. So this color pair has a lot of foretell. I'm not going to go into all of it. It's all over the place in this color pair, and that's why it's the archetype. And there's lots of it to help you power Vega the Watcher and Clarion Spirit and all of these really sweet things. So what rares are there in blue-white that fit well into this deck? Well, there is Cosmos Charger, which not only has Foretell, but also makes it so foretelling costs 1 less mana, and you can do it on any player's turn, in addition to just having, really good stats. Now, Starnheim Unleashed is going to be good in literally every white deck, but it is a mythic rare with Foretell, and this deck will get extra value out of that. Similarly, Alron's Epiphany, going to be pretty good in any blue deck, more or less, but it does have Foretell, so it fits in well here. Mystic Reflection is a card with Foretell and cheap Foretell, so setting up a second spell is easy. I don't love the card itself, but it is cheap, so it does, decent things given how much it costs. Glorious Protector, another card with Foretell. Doomscar is a board sweeper with Foretell. You also have Alrund, God of the Cosmos. This side of him is just straight up a Foretold Payoff because he likes cards to be in the Foretold zone in the exile area, and he gets bigger if you have them. So that's blue-white. It's the first of 2 Foretell color pairs. The other one is black-white, and there aren't any cards in this color pair that say, if you foretell stuff, good stuff happens, but instead we have more cards that deal with double spelling, with Furia, Judge of Valor, the primary signpost uncommon for the deck. Anytime you cast your second spell, you get to look at the top 3 cards of your library and put one of them in your hand and one of them into your graveyard. So it's a powerful payoff. So what are the double spell payoffs? Well, we've already seen Clarion Spirit, Doomscar Oracle, Code Spell Cleric, but black brings a couple of really good ones to the table. One of them is Bloodsky Berserker, which gets larger and gains Menace on the turn when you cast a second spell. The counters stick around forever. Similarly, Infernal Pet gets a counter too anytime you do a second spell and gains a keyword until end of turn, in this case, flying. So what rares go well here? Well, you've got Dream Devourer, who is a Foretell Payoff and gives Foretell to all your cards. You also have a couple of cards here. I mentioned that there's not like a tribal focus outside of the first 3 color pairs we looked at, but there is sort of a tribal secondary theme, usually at higher rarities within some of these color pairs. And what we have with Furia's Retribution and Righteous Valkyrie are angel payoffs, but of course they're both rare. So really making them work for your angel deck, you're not going to be able to make a quote-unquote angel deck very well in this format because the rares are at the top here. But you don't have to try that hard if you're in black-white either. So Furia's Retribution and Righteous Valkyrie here, you're going to have other angels in your deck if you're in this color pair, and they're going to do some decent work for you. All right, so those are the 2 Foretell color pairs, black-white and blue-white. From here, we're going to look at the last 3 color pairs. And while most of the first ones we've looked at today have all been kind of unique with very Kaldheim-y themes, the last 2 we're going to look at all have sort of traditional archetypes for their color pair. And they're all pretty aggressive decks too. Let's look first at red-white. So red-white is an aggro deck, but it cares about a few things. It likes to go wide, it likes equipment, and it likes auras. So Call the Forge Master really tells you all of that in one card, which is nice. He likes it when you have equipment and auras because creatures that have those things return to your hand if they die. And he gives creature tokens you control that are enchanted or equipped +1/+1. So he likes tokens, he likes auras, he likes equipment. He's telling you a lot of what he likes to do there. Forging the Tyrite Sword has a Chapter 3 that lets you tutor up an equipment. And Axguard Armory, the utility land, the uncommon utility land here, lets you search your library for an aura and or an equipment card in the late game. And generally, you're hoping you can get one of each, draw 2 cards off of it, and this deck should be able to do that because there's decent equipment and auras in this format. Almost all of the equipment and all of the auras that are in this set are at least playable, which isn't usually true. So this color pair is going to be a little more well supported than maybe what we see sometimes. So let's start first with equipment and aura payoffs. So we know we've already got these 3. Call the Forge Master, Forging the Tyrite Sword, and Axguard Armory. There's also something like Battlefield Raptor. So this is sort of here as a stand-in for any creature that's efficient, evasive, and has other keyword abilities. It'll be a great place to put auras and equipment because, it starts with unimpressive stats, but if you can make it bigger, because of flying and first strike, it's going to get some pretty good mileage out of auras and equipment. Master Skald lets you return an artifact or enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand if you have a creature to exile. Starnheim Courser reduces the cost of artifacts and enchantment spells, which, means equipment and auras. Spectral Steel is an aura, and it's one that can, if it goes to your graveyard, bring back auras and equipment from your graveyard to your hand. I also have Fearless Pup, so basically anything with Boast, it's kind of a stand-in here too. It also has a keyword ability, but anything with Boast can get some extra value out of equipment and auras too, because it suddenly becomes a lot harder to block them if you put auras and equipment on them, and then you can use those Boast abilities a little more freely because your creature will be able to attack more. Same thing with Tuskiri Firewalker. It's a creature with Boast that will work well in this deck. So Ruined Crown here works well in this deck too. There are runes in every color, so it's not only going to work here, but it is an equipment and it searches up auras, so it's really at its best in this particular deck. So that's sort of the equipment and aura theme that we have going on. Again, almost all the equipment and all the auras are solid at the very least in this format, and so you'll be able to run them without really being sad about it like in some formats. So going wide, like I said, is the other theme. So here I'm going to look at cards that help you go wide and cards that pay you off for going wide at common and uncommon. So you've got Warhorn Blast, which gives +2/+1 to your whole board. You have Open the Omen Paths, which in addition to being a potential ramp/fixing spell, can also give +1/+0 to your whole board. You have Battershield Warrior, whose Boast ability pumps everything. You also have Beskir's Shieldmate, which doesn't go wide in the sense that it comes into play and gives you a 1/1 all at once, but the fact that if it dies, it still keeps a body around means that Warhorn Blast and Open the Omen Pass and Battershield Warrior can be more potent because at least you're not losing a creature entirely, you're getting something out of the deal. Shepherd of the Cosmos lets you reanimate a small thing from your graveyard, so you do get 2 bodies for 1 card in that case. Usher of the Fallen is a card with Boast that makes creature tokens. Doomscar Titan is a great payoff for going wide because it lets you give +1/+0 and haste to your whole board when it comes down. Dwarven Reinforcements, a way to make some more creature tokens. Same thing with Fearless Liberator. It's a Boast card that makes creature tokens. So, what are the rares that go well in this color pair? Well, Runeforged Champion will be at his best here because he likes runes, and this is the best deck for them. Reckless Crew isn't a card I love, but if there's a deck for it, it will be this one. I didn't talk about vehicles at all, and that's because there aren't any other vehicle payoffs in this color pair or in the set, really, other than Reckless Crew. Obviously, the cards that make artifacts cheaper do go well with vehicles, but they aren't ultra well supported. And so mostly, anyway, though, Reckless Crew pays you off more for having equipment because it lets you equip the dwarves you make for free if you want to, but it is going to be hard to get enough value out of it for it to be worth it. Stornheim Unleashed, I've already shown it. It's going to be good in all the decks, but it does help you go wide, so it'll have some nice extra synergy here. Magda Brazen Outlaw. So this is the color pair that is the dwarfiest, as you may have noticed, but Magda is the only dwarf payoff, so it's not a dwarf deck per se, but she does give you a dwarf payoff. She's just at rare. She also makes treasure, which is useful. So I also have Showdown of the Scalds here. It's not maybe as obvious that this is like a straight up payoff, but by giving you all these extra cards, it's going to make it so you can go wider, and then you have the ability to make your creatures bigger off the spells that it hits. Halvar, God of Battle, is obviously enough the best equipment or aura payoff in the set. Gives everything equipped or enchanted, double strike, and it lets you move for free an aura or an equipment every turn. His other side, also really good in this deck, Sword of the Realms. Gives a nice stats boost, but the real value comes from the fact that if that creature dies, well, it doesn't. It comes back to your hand. I also have Toralf's Hammer here. The other side of Toralf is nice too. And the great thing about all these gods is how flexible they are, but the Toralf side is an equipment, so I included it here. Resplendent Marshal I have here. It's going to be good in all the white decks, but this deck will have a lot of dwarves, and so in a way it's kind of a dwarf payoff because you can exile a dwarf from your graveyard and pump a bunch of... So that's red-white. It's an aggro deck. Cares about auras, equipment, and going wide. Let's move now to green-white, where the main focus is on tokens. So our signpost uncommon here, Maya Bredegard Protector, first of all, is a great payoff for going wide because she will pump your whole board, and she also makes tokens for you. So she's sort of a one-woman army. You're just going to end up with a bunch of creature tokens that are all bigger because of her Anthem effect. There's also the Rare Saga Battle for Bredegard, which makes a couple of creature tokens and then lets you double the number of tokens you have in play with Chapter 3, which will fit in quite well here. So, let's look at things that make tokens and the payoffs for making tokens. So we've got Battershield Warrior again, pumps your whole board. That fits in well here. Clarion Spirit makes those spirit tokens. It's probably a little better in black, white, or blue, white because those decks will be better at making the tokens, but this deck won't have a hard time making a couple of them. We have Beskir's Shieldmate again, Usher of the Fallen. I've also included Valkyrie's Sword here. Makes you an Angel Warrior creature token if you pay that mana. You also have access to Elderleaf Mentor, which makes 2 bodies with 1 card. Elven Bow, which makes an elf token. King Harold's Revenge, which is a payoff for going wide because it gives 1 creature +1/+1 for each creature you control, and gives it trample. There's of course also Maya, who's both of those things, and Warhorn Blast, which can pump your whole board. So what rares fit in well here? Again, Resplendent Marshal will work well here because it likes to put counters on a bunch of creatures at once. Battle for Bredegard lets you double your tokens and makes tokens. We've got Starnheim Unleashed again. It makes tokens. Essica's Chariot. This is probably the one of these that's like the most upgraded by being in this deck because not only does it make you creature tokens, but it's a vehicle that when it attacks copies a creature token. Blessing of Frost. If you have snow mana, this can be pretty good because it puts +1/+1 counters on your whole board. Probably better in the snow decks because this deck has very little interest in snow, but you'll end up with some snow lands, so it could be worth it. So, green-white tokens, that's an archetype we see all the time. We only have 1 color pair left, and it's really one that it seems the least focused into one area or another, I think, and that's black-red. Wizard says that this is a boast color pair, and black and red do have boast, but they don't even have the most boast of all the color pairs. It's actually red-white that has the most boast, and there's only 1 boast payoff at common or uncommon, and it's red. And there's also a rare boast payoff, it's also red. So there's no reason that this is really a boast color pair. In general, it seems more like it's an aggro color pair. If we look at our Signpost Uncommon Cardor Doomscourge, he forces your opponent's creatures to attack you. If attacking creatures die, life is drained. And this kind of does work with Boast in the sense that it gets all your opponent's blockers out of the way, and then you can attack with your boasters. But most of the time, it's kind of going to feel like a win more effect, I think, because if you play Cardor, force your opponent to attack you, there's a good chance you can just attack them back for a huge amount of damage, and then also add to your board instead of boasting. You've also got Cardor's Vicious Return, which kind of seems like it's trying to say this is a sacrifice deck, but there's not really much in this set other than this that really pushes you in that direction. Then it also reanimates stuff, so what's going on there? There's just a lot going on in this color pair that makes it unclear, but what it does have going on is really aggressive creatures, and a Signpost Common like Cardor, which can have major impacts on games. You might also be thinking, well, this is a Berserker color pair. And yeah, there's some of that, but it's all at rare. So again, it's not really a Berserker deck. It's a deck that has some Berserkers in it, and there's like 2 payoffs, and they're both rare. So yeah, that's where I'll end my discussion of black-red. Like I said, it's an aggro deck. You're just going to want to curve out, attack people, and that's pretty much what it has going on. It isn't really built around Boast. It isn't a Berserker deck. It's just an aggro deck. All right, well, those were the 10 archetypes for Kaldheim Limited. This Wednesday, January 27th, I will be taking part in the Kaldheim Early Access event that Wizards invited me to on Magic Arena, and I'll be streaming Kaldheim drafts that day, so come hang out then if you can. You can find my Twitch channel in the description of this video. Also, if you want to buy any of the cards in this video, or some Kaldheim packs so you can draft with your friends, you can find a link in the description that will take you directly to Card Kingdom's store using my referral link. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future set reviews and Kaldheim draft videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you're looking for the whole Kaldheim set review, you should see it on your screen now. Thanks for watching.